right, so that's how we're training force. We're going to lift heavy weights. We're going to go to failure. We're going to try and build the muscle mass in the cross-sectional area by lifting heavy weights to failure, supporting that with leucine-rich protein, supporting that with a little bit of creatine in the evening that's going to give us more phosphocreatine so we can regenerate ATP faster. We're going to do a little beta-alanine so that we can, again, buffer any hydrogen ions that you're producing in these high power, high strength, high force movements that you're trying to do. Now what we're going to do is we're going to try and break down this other aspect of this. And this is the learning component, this neural component, or the force transfer component. And that's what we're doing to increase velocity. So we're doing the velocity of movement. And so the velocity of movement, remember, we talked about force, lift a heavy weight. Velocity, you need to lift a light weight. You can't lift a heavy weight and go fast. Nobody can do that. It's just not really what we do. So what we are going to do now is we're going to shift to a focus on velocity. And we want to be as big and strong as possible before we do this, because the velocity component, yes, we're going to peak for that power performance that we're trying to do. But as we do that, because we're having to work at lower and lower forces, lower and lower loads to move as fast as we can, what's happening? The muscle is getting weaker over time. And we'll see that in the paper we looked at. All right. So the first thing is we can train our brains. We can train our brains so there's more explosive, so that it puts out more cortical energy, because our cortex is where we're going to do our motor program. So our brain, our cortical brain, is going to send out the signal to the right muscles at the right time to really drive that muscle forward. And so this is called cortical stimulation, or motor evoked potentials. So how much motor drive are we getting from the brain? And what this is a super cool study, because what they did is they did self-paced strength training here versus a control. No difference in kind of the motor drive that you get. So if you self-pace your strength training, no difference. But if you now simply put in a metronome that goes tuk, 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 and you pace yourself based on that metronome. So if it's a 2 seconds, the metronome has to go back and forth twice. And so now you're super concentrating that you've got the movement exactly the way that that metronome paces it. What happens to your motor evoked potential? It goes up twofold. So now we can actually use our brain to drive more focus into whatever that activity is that we're doing. You can do the same thing by looking at visual motor skills. So you can practice your visual motor skills. And again, what you're doing is you're learning how to do the movement. Here what we're doing is we're actually getting, even if anything, a little bit better response, where we can actually teach the brain to be a little bit more explosive in driving that movement. So that's super cool, that if we use something outside and we pace our strength training based on an external stimulus, where we're focused on the external stimulus as well as the strength training, now we get a greater thing. So we're using more of our brain, and the result is we drive an increase in cortical drive. All right. So that's one thing. We know that neural adaptation is possible, because these are two cool studies as well, where here what they did is they did a training study. And what they did is they did one group that actually did muscle contraction. They did another group that actually did just imaged, and this was actually just in the fingers. So you're imagining that you're going to do some movement, or you're actually doing some movement, you're practicing. And then they measured the strength change over training. Look at, imagining doing the movement was just almost as good as actually doing the movement itself. Because as you're imagining it, you're turning on the right muscles to produce the movement. So you actually get stronger just by imagining the movement. The second study on the left-hand side here is another cool one. What they did here is they strength trained one arm, and then they measured strength in the other arm. And what they looked at is the change in strength in the trained arm. So if I was training my left arm and I got my left arm 40%, 50% stronger, and then I measured the strength in my right arm, if we go up to the line and we go across, my left arm increased 50%, my right arm would have increased 20%. The reason for this is that we generalize our motor programs. So if I'm doing something on my right hand and I'm going to do it really hard and I need to train and learn how to do that movement, I'm going to produce a motor program to do that. But now, if I look at the left arm, now because my motor program for this one is generalized just for moving the arm, now this is an arm. And if I move this arm, I actually get stronger in this one, even if I'm just doing the exercise in the opposite arm. And that is just this generalized neural adaptation that we get with training. We can either imagine it, we can do a heavy exercise in one arm and our other arm will get stronger. It won't get bigger, but it'll get stronger because we've produced a motor program for this arm that we're going to generalize and use for the other arm. And then if you combine it, so it's possible now to say, what happens if I really heavy lift this arm and I use an external stimulus like a metronome to really get me a lot of extra motor cortical stimulation? Now, does that increase my strength on the other arm even more? And it's entirely possible that it does. All right, so what we're going to do is, first thing is, yes, we can train the neural system. But the reality is in elite athletes, they've been lifting weights, they've been doing their sport for a long time. So there's very little learning that really needs to be done. But we can still improve power. And the way that we do that is by maximizing the velocity of the movements that we're looking at. So this is the study that you're looking at for this lecture. And they're looking at the change in jump height that happens if you don't do anything, if you do strength training, if you do plyometric training, or if you do max power training. And max power training is do the movement, but use 0 to 30% of your 1 rep max. So 1 rep max, you've got a number, and a lot of times the 0 to 30%, that's body weight, maybe a little bit more. Okay, so 0% is body weight, and then the 1 rep max component of it going up to 30%, it's a very low weight. And so what we're doing is we're moving as fast as we can with a light weight. And that's what max power is. And you can see that if you practice moving super fast, what's going to happen is you are going to improve your performance. You're going to train your power. You're training that velocity component. You're not training the strength component, you're training the velocity component. But if you start that training, and this is from Cromries, when she was doing some of this work, what she did here is she's doing the same thing where she's using max power to train a group of people. And part of the group, a third of the group, was strong to begin with. They'd already trained a lot, so they have bigger muscles, bigger, stronger muscles at the beginning. Then you had a weaker group who had smaller, less strong muscles. And then you had a control group. All right? And so then what they did is they did their max power training. And what they can show is that if you are stronger when you enter the program, you actually improve power. And you can see that here. You can both generate more negative power as well as more positive power than individuals who are in the weaker group. The control group, they just didn't exercise. So it's two groups. Sorry about the confusion there. The strong group, the weaker group, and then a control group that didn't do the training in between. When you train, yes, you can improve your power over the control group. And if you happen to be stronger, when you start your training, you're going to improve your power significantly more than somebody who is weaker. Okay? So really what you want to do is you want to start your max power as strong as you're going to be. So when we're talking about power, it's force times velocity. So what you do is you increase force maximally. You're in your base phase, essentially, for training, for strength and for power work. What you're doing is your base phase is to increase your strength as much as you physically can. And then as you've done that, now what you're going to do is you're going to focus that. And in your pre-competition phase, where you're trying to really focus the work and improve your performance so that you're optimal for the day of performance, now what you're going to do is you're going to move to the lighter weight movements where you're going at a higher velocity, and that's going to give you the greatest amount of power. You start those movements really strong, you're going to get the most amount of power out of them. All right, so what happens so that's kind of this idea of max power training. So what happens when we do this kind of plyometric or max power training? We increase muscle stiffness. The muscle tendon stiffness, the joint stiffness around the joint, or the stiffness around the joints goes way up, and that's going to result in the